It's so tempting, particularly when you're young or naive or perhaps a little bit inexperienced, to believe that in general the world is good, that the people around you have the best intentions for you, and to sort of want to see the best in everyone. I was definitely in this category of women until very recently. And I think if you are someone who is particularly young or perhaps a little bit whimsical or generally more positive, then it's an easy trap to fall into, not to see necessarily some red flags and to unconsciously fall into certain traps and to be targeted by people who might not have your best intentions in mind specifically, people who are psychological predators in one way or another. And I think unknowingly I've been attracting these types of people. And it's, on one hand, it's my own fault. Obviously what happened is not my fault, but I'm realizing now that some of my actions perhaps led to me attracting this type of person and not necessarily having the framework to protect myself against it. In the past, I think we relied a lot more on passing down traditions and stories that kind of teach you how to behave and how to look after yourself, particularly if you're a woman. And this is something that one of my favorite authors touches on in this book, Women Who Run with the Wolves, which is a very good book, which I highly recommend. But in it, she talks about a very specific example that I think is very relevant to the question of why do you attract predators? Why do you attract narcissists and psychopaths and sociopaths, or maybe not even anyone necessarily diagnosed, but with those kind of traits and characteristics who are opportunistic perhaps in your desire to love openly and freely. But she essentially uses a bunch of different folktales and myths as examples of the kind of messages that we used to try to pass down for this kind of knowledge, for this kind of intuitive information. And for this specific example, she uses the story of Bluebeard, which I'll give a quick summary just so you guys know what I'm talking about. But essentially, there are three sisters, and a wise old wizard comes to town named Bluebeard. The older two sisters sense that something is wrong about Bluebeard and they don't want to marry him, but the younger one is charmed by his money, by his good looks, by his palace, and she marries him. So after the marriage, she goes to live in his house and he gives her a big ring of keys and he says you're allowed to go into any of the rooms, any of these keys unlock apart from the little door on the top floor. You're never ever allowed to go inside that door. So the young girl occupies herself with visiting all of the rooms, but eventually she grows bored and she opens the door to the secret room where she finds this is quite graphic, the bodies of his 6 previous wives essentially. And he is furious, he tries to kill her, but in the last moment her sisters come and save her and they kill Bluebeard and they live happily ever after essentially. Obviously I've omitted quite a few details, but the message of the story is that this girl ignored her intuition and ignored the advice of her elder sisters, of her family, and she fell prey to someone who was targeting young maidens only to be saved eventually by her older sisters, which is not always a privilege that everyone gets. I think often in our desire for love or for being able to see the beauty in things, we perhaps ignore or bypass some of the things that signal danger in that sense. There's a quote that actually really stuck with me. I'll read it to you guys now. The problem is that ego desires to feel wonderful, but a yen for the paradisical, when combined with naivete, makes us not fulfilled, but food for the predator. This acquiescence to marrying the monster is actually decided when girls are very young, usually before 5 years of age. They are taught not to see and instead to make pretty all manner of grotesqueries, whether they are lovely or not. This training is why the youngest sister can say, his beard isn't really that blue. This early training to be nice causes women to override their intuitions. In that sense, they are actually purposefully taught to submit to the predator. Imagine a wolf mother teaching her young to be nice in the face of an angry ferret or a wily diamondback rattler. I think it rings very true that we have a desire to see the good in people when perhaps there actually is very little good there, or to brush over things that should alarm us in favor of the romance or being swept up in the moment or by the shiny palace and the beautiful looks and whatever else. But I remember when I first sort of started speaking about my desire to get married and have a lot of kids and be a stay-at-home mother, someone asked me how I would protect myself against people taking advantage of that or being opportunistic perhaps in my desire. And I didn't really have an answer for them at the time. I don't think I really responded very well to that, but it's naive to assume that your first will be your only and that you will go through life without ever coming into contact with people who want to take advantage of you. And it's something that I should have confronted a lot sooner because it would have saved me a lot of pain. But I think a lot of the times when we're young or perhaps inexperienced, we think we know everything and we insist on becoming involved with people that perhaps there's a little voice at the back of our minds that says isn't good for us, and it's only through experience that we can necessarily become shocked awake and kind of realize the gravity of our own safety and the weight that it holds. I find that intuition is almost like a muscle that has to be worked and practiced. If you ignore what your intuition is telling you, then over time the voice will get smaller and smaller. I don't think I'm there yet necessarily. There have been many times when I have listened to my intuition and it was correct, but also a few times when it's been very strong and I've ignored it, perhaps from that desire to make nice or to make beautiful things that aren't. But this is why I think things like sisterhood and things like a good relationship with your family is so important, because very often other people have gone through experiences that have led them to recognize signs that perhaps you are unfamiliar with and unprepared to deal with. It's so easy to forget that if you are someone who is quite naive and whimsical, that you will attract people who are the very opposite of that and who are quite opportunistic. But it's important to remember that it's not necessarily a fault with your character, but rather a fault with your warning signals in that sense, with your ability to detect when you're being taken advantage of and when things are not necessarily going in your favor. I think this ties in very well with the idea that when you're in a relationship, you kind of want to fix somebody. This is something I see a lot and something I've participated in, is the idea like, oh, I can fix him. Somehow you believe that your love will be the reason that this person gets better or that they change, when the thing that they were never missing was your love. It was more, I mean, I don't know what causes people to do these things. I've never been on that side, but it's not your love that's going to cure them. Love has never cured anyone. No one ever has thought to themselves, oh wow, this girl is so amazing. She does everything for me. She loves me so much. I guess I'll change for her. All they're going to see is my behavior is being rewarded with so much love, and I'm only going to continue to do it because perhaps the worse I'll act, the more love I'll get. And it's a very difficult cycle to break out of. People will take what you give them, and that is why I think you need to give much less than you get, especially in the early stages of a relationship. There is a reason that religious tradition teaches you not to give up too much of yourself too early as a woman and to wait for marriage, to do all of these things. And that is a way of protecting you, but also remembering not to rush into things with people who aren't necessarily kind or selfless is an important thing that I think has been forgotten to be taught to many young people. To get married or to enter into a serious relationship before you've become cognizant of the dangers of the dating market or of predatory people is putting yourself at risk and putting your future at risk. And once you're deep into that kind of relationship, it's so the further you go, the more difficult it is to get out. That is why I'm so grateful that in my recent situation that kind of changed my worldview, it ended very quickly, and I listened to my intuition as soon as it became loud enough for me to say, hey, get out of there. And that's not to say necessarily that I blame people who are stuck in those kind of relationships. I think very often that's tied in to things like self-worth and self-esteem, as well as things like not listening to your intuition or not necessarily being able to rely on the people around you to guide you when you're in the wrong. I just think that it's important going forward that we're aware of perhaps our own limitations in understanding other people's intentions. It's very easy to be lied to or to be charmed by someone who lies, essentially. People with narcissistic, sociopathic traits, they don't get me wrong, are very often very charming, but it's to their own benefit. I think going forward, I'm going to be very wary of people who are perhaps overly charming, because very often it's for self-gain. I don't think I've ever met someone who is selflessly charming. Is that true? I'm not sure. So far, I don't think I've met anyone who is truly selfless and fully charming, because charm is something that you kind of have to develop with a lot of work and a lot of understanding in how to perhaps manipulate people. I'll read one more quote from Women Who Run with the Wolves that I quite liked at the end of the chapter. As long as a woman is forced into believing she is powerless and/or is trained to not consciously register what she knows to be true, the feminine impulses and gifts of her psyche continue to be killed off. When the youthful spirit marries the predator, she is captured or restrained during a time in her life that was meant to be an unfoldment. Instead of living freely, she begins to live falsely. The deceitful promise of the predator is that the woman will become a queen in some way, when in fact her murder is being planned. There is a way out of all of this, but one must have a key. I like that quote, but I think now is perhaps a time of solitude for me and a little bit of internal reflection and trying to decide what I want and how to find what I want, how to attract what I want, because that is something that is very important to me. And as someone whose life purpose goal is to live in as much love and to express as much love, to live as the embodiment of love, it's something that I need to take very seriously. And I hope that anyone else who is concerned with romantic relationships does the same. But I'm gonna share anything that I learn along the way. I still don't know what I'm doing fully, but I'm just sharing lessons that I learn along the way and hoping that it helps someone. But I think that's all I really have to say for today. God bless and goodbye.